Sup YouTube, it's your boy Slide8Fry here. I'm not going to have much commentary to this react. I'm actually going to try to avoid doing pauses as much as I can. If you saw my react video earlier today, I mentioned there was a goal of doing 30 deliveries today to get an extra $30 on top of how much I'd make from those 30 deliveries, and that didn't work out. Too many restaurants were being too slow and causing me to not deliver as quickly. Wasn't even close. Anyways, I'm actually going to do that other React video I was thinking of doing because I'm noticing that the Ryan George React is not performing too well, so I'd like to actually try to do the Karl Jobst one I was initially intending on doing.
Legends. When it comes to speedrunning, there are very few communities that are as ancient as the group of players surrounding the classic first-person shooter, GoldenEye 007. For almost a quarter of a century, devoted gamers have been attempting to crack open GoldenEye's secrets in the pursuit of making the end screen show the lowest possible time. But despite their best efforts, speedrunners haven't really been able to achieve anything too crazy. It's an astoundingly rock-solid game. Not a single out-of-bounds exploit exists, and most of the quote-unquote game-breaking strategies involve very simplistic techniques that are very easy to understand. It does have its quirks though, like the fact that its inconsistent frame rate requires the use of chronic lookdown in order to run as fast as possible. Lookdown has been around for a long time, almost 20 years, but it's not the oldest trick in the book. That honor goes to the humble technique known as the warp. It's the most common exploit used in the game. It's used on almost every single level. If you aren't paying attention, you probably wouldn't even realize it was being performed. It doesn't jump out and demand attention, but it's very important and a staple in every speedrunner's arsenal. The premise is simple. By switching weapons, you can squeeze through smaller gaps than you otherwise could. You can use it to get through a sliding door just that little bit quicker. Warping is so old, so simple, so common that it's the last technique I would ever expect to be blown open by a new idea. And yet, 24 years after GoldenEye's release, that's exactly what has just happened. A new way to warp has just been found, and in hindsight, it's shocking that it wasn't found 20 years ago. Nonetheless, its discovery has dismantled one of GoldenEye's levels, resulting in multiple new world records. In today's video, we will explore the history of the warp, and the new version that hid in plain sight for over 2 decades. I hope you enjoy. Now, before we go on, this video is sponsored by Skillshare, and I really do...
Let's skip ahead.
The concept of warping dates back to at least 1999. While not completely refined, players definitely knew that the speed at which you could exit through sliding doors could improve significantly given the right circumstances. Sliding doors don't open immediately, and generally you need to wait while the door slowly opens before the gap is big enough to pass through. By warping, you can squeeze through while the gap is small, therefore saving time. Originally, warping was attempted by either shooting into the wall besides the door or by switching weapons. The goal of both of these actions is the same, which is to create what speedrunners call lag. But more accurately, what players are really after is a large drop in the frame rate. The low frame rate is what allows Bond to pass through incredibly small holes, and it's a byproduct of the way the game calculates Bond's position. It's actually a very similar mechanic to what other gamers use to pass through walls. Mario 64 is the easiest comparison because most of you know it already, and this is where players build up so much speed that in a single frame they can cross from one side of the door to the other. In GoldenEye we are essentially doing the same thing, but not by increasing Bond's speed, but rather by lowering the frame rate. Bond's speed is calculated separately from the frame rate, so the lower the frame rate, the faster his relative speed is. There is one major difference though. Bond cannot pass through walls. There does have to be some kind of gap. If you've ever used explosives in GoldenEye, you would be well aware of how taxing it is to the game's frame rate, and a similar, although weaker effect can be achieved by shooting directly into a wall. This is why shooting was used when warping was initially implemented. It was discovered rather quickly, however, that the best way to achieve a good warp is to switch weapons. This is because of the quick change in drawn polygons on the screen, which for a brief moment induces sufficient load on the console to lower the frame rate. The craziest warp by far is the depot warp, which allows Bond to squeeze through a gap barely more than a pixel wide. You can't even see it, and it's so precise that it can take several hours to achieve a single time. Warps weren't just allocated to squeezing through gaps either. It's also used to climb ladders instantly. GoldenEye's collision detection is quasi-3D with a lot of 2D elements, and as a result of this, vertical obstacles can be bypassed entirely by a similar mechanism. And it doesn't just work on ladders. Basically, any vertical platform that Bond can jump off of can be climbed by warping. A good example is the pit on Aztec. It's antiquated now, but the very first strategies on this level involved killing Jaws and then warping back up this pit in order to complete the stage in the best order.
Wow.
Turbo mode is where warps become fun, and the Turbo Mode League is a casual competition that some speedrunners partake in. Bond's increased speed makes warps significantly easier, to the point where many of them no longer require a weapon switch or a drop in frame rate. Something like the depot warp becomes trivial, and it's why it was used in turbo mode many years before it was legitimately used in speedruns. Many of the crazy warps we see today were first used with turbo mode, and it's how many of them were initially discovered. All of them were eventually ported to normal records though. Well, all of them except one. There is one warp that was known about and used in turbo mode competition for 20 years that had never been implemented in standard play, and that was the Bunker 2 cell warp.
Okay.
On Bunker 2, you begin locked in a jail cell with no weapon, but you do have a watch with a magnet attract feature that can be used to collect a key hanging on the opposite wall. The only way to select it is by pausing, which is why every speedrun begins with a pause. There is a tiny gap between the...
I always thought the key came from the guard, not from the wall. I didn't even notice it was on the wall.
Bars and the door that theoretically can be used to warp through. With turbo mode, it's a joke. You can simply run straight through. This has been known about for at least 2 decades, and in 2003, Brian Bossart got a pretty decent time of 16 seconds with the cheat on, which is still only 1 second behind the current turbo mode record. Without cheats on, this warp is a whole different story. Technically, you can warp through by switching weapons. It's extremely precise and hard to do, comparable to the depot warp, but there is one major problem.
You don't start out with weapons there, so it's illegitimate.
You don't have any weapons to switch to or from. The only way you can possibly switch weapons is by pausing, selecting the watch magnet, unpausing, and then switching from the magnet to unarmed. But if you do that, you may as well just use the magnet. Warping these cell doors a bit faster, but realistically it's not fast enough to have any real chance of beating the existing world record, especially given that the record was already so tight, resulting in a time of around 23.9 seconds, so it would need to be a full second faster, which I think theoretically it could be, but the odds of getting a perfect warp and doing everything else perfectly was just far too low. People had fiddled around with it though. Randy Bukima tested it out in 2015, and Matthew Burden recorded a pretty nice warp in 2017. But it was so inconsistent, no one had a single run that had any chance of getting a good time. The cell warp was relegated to the list of theoretical, TAS-only strategies that will likely never see the light of day. Now, let's talk about a different technique that is definitely not related to any potential game-breaking strategies. I repeat, what I'm about to talk about is completely irrelevant. It could never be applied here. It's called the Arlene throw. I have mentioned it a few times before. It was number 3 on my top 5 hardest tricks video. Definitely do not go and watch that. My voice sounded terrible back then. The Arlene throw is a way to throw objects much further than normal. By pressing R, you bring out the crosshair, which allows you to aim more precisely. If you press the left or right C buttons while aiming, Bond will very quickly lean left or right. This is an extremely effective strategy in multiplayer if you want to peek out momentarily to shoot your opponent. When leaning left or right, Bond moves a lot quicker than he does when he is running. But it only lasts a split second. If you time a throw well enough, you can use that brief momentum to throw a grenade or a mine an insane distance. If you want the furthest possible throw, you need to lean to one side and then quickly lean to the opposite side in one motion. This achieves a faster speed than just going from neutral to one side. Let's talk about another absolutely random technique that in no way, shape or form relates to this video. I don't even know why I'm bringing it up. But this is footage of myself from all the way back in the year 2000.
Damn.
I'm speedrunning Aztec on Secret Agent, and at the time I was playing this, many of you watching weren't even born. I mentioned before that we used to kill Jaws and then warp back up the pit, and this was done by switching weapons, which you can see demonstrated by the first truly dominant world champion, Sterling Neblett, in 1999. But for some strange reason, I didn't use this method, and if you watch closely, you can see the crosshair appear when I try to warp up. This is because I'm using a different technique, which is to lean into the wall, which produces enough speed to achieve a warp. I have no idea how I learned this method, and I can't find any other footage of anyone else ever doing it. It's definitely interesting though to revisit an old, outdated trick that no one has thought about or used for so long. Now, where were we? Oh yes, we were talking about the Bunker 2 cell warp, and why it was never really used because switching weapons was both incredibly difficult and not much faster. So if this particular warp is to ever be implemented, we would need to find a different way of doing it. But alas, no other warps exist. Wait a minute, didn't I just mention that I used to use a different type of warp 20 years ago? Didn't I also just mention that the fastest speed you can achieve is by leaning? Could it be possible that just by leaning you can warp through gaps? I mean, that's such an obvious idea that if it were true, it would have surely been used already. There is just no way the entire speedrunning community didn't think of this extremely obvious idea for over 2 decades.
Whoa.
Son of a bitch.
Yeah. That's crazy.
The funny thing about this new warp is that it wasn't even first discovered by someone within the speedrunning community. All the way back in October of last year, a completely random, unassociated person called Arcady uploaded a video of themselves playing Bunker 2 on emulator, where they warped the cell door with a lean. This video would sit unwatched for almost a full year, until by complete chance, Arcady's channel was found by speedrunners of the Xbox Live Arcade version of GoldenEye that was leaked earlier this year. On initial impression, it was assumed to be an emulator-only glitch, but as soon as someone tried it on console, it worked. Granted, it's slightly more complicated than merely leaning into the gap. You do have to do it in a particular way to make it work. But still, this definitely should have been discovered years ago. The lean method of warping can be used anywhere, but it's really only beneficial at the moment on Bunker 2. This is mainly because when you bring up the crosshair, you can no longer run, so you lose maximum running speed. Where possible, it is still faster to switch weapons to warp. It saves a ton of time on Bunker 2 though. 3 seconds on the easiest difficulty Agent, and 5 seconds on both Secret and 00 Agent. The Agent world record has already been brought down from 23 seconds to 20 seconds, and 00 Agent has been lowered a single second. Mind you, Bunker 2 on Secret and 00 Agent is a really complicated level, so it will still take some time before the full time save is realized. I can't emphasize enough how shocking this discovery is, purely because it's so obvious in hindsight. People have been thinking about the cell warp for so many years, and this simple method was never tried a single time. I mean, we already took advantage of the speed generated by leaning to perform throws, and it's such a small leap of logic to apply it to warps. This really makes me think. Are there any other super obvious strategies that are still hidden in plain sight?
There could be.
There probably is. And at the end of the day, that just makes me incredibly excited to see what happens next. As always, thank you so much for watching, you legends. I hope you are having a fantastic day, and I will see you in the next video.
That went by really quickly. Of course, I only paused it once, so that probably helps with that. Alright, well, thank you so much for watching this video with me. I appreciate that. What do you think about that new technique? Like, yeah, I recall that GoldenEye is one of the oldest games to be, one of the earliest games to be very well speedrun. Like, people were speedrunning this game for a long time. Obviously, I think the game that's been has the most speedruns is Super Mario 64. So many speedrun videos of in the early YouTube years. Same with GoldenEye. And yeah, there's Perfect Dark's also a big one in that regard as well, I think. Which Karl Jobst is actually a little more known for when it comes to his own speedruns. Anyways, Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Click that bell icon to add me notifications. What did you think about that new trick that somehow some random person with only 100 subscribers found on an emulator on a video that like didn't even get views until like a year later? Like, that's crazy how that works out. I bet his subscriber count has gone up a lot more since then. Sometimes you need that one video to really push you where you need to be. For me, I have a video that has 1 million views, but I only have 1,600 subscribers, but that video came out like in 2010. Anyways, that'll do it. Let's upload this.